Transgender identities, the church, and what the Bible has to say. Let's talk about all of it with Dr. Preston Sprinkle on Steve Brown, etc.
He's an old white guy, an author, broadcaster, and seminary professor who's sick of religion. And he's brought friends. Please welcome Steve Brown, etc.
That's the name of the program, and we're so glad you're here. You always have a seat at our table. I'm Steve, by the way, the aforementioned old white guy. Our favorite megachurch pastor, Zach Van Dyke, is here. Yesterday, Zach tweeted, "Leaving the gym."
Oh.
Zach, can you clarify, were you exiting the gym or was this a breakup?
No. It was my first time back in a year, and so I was holding myself accountable. I went again today, Steve. 2 days in a row.
Did you leave again
Proud
today?
of you. 2 days isn't going to do it, but it's a good start.
I mean, I just I did the treadmill for like 5 minutes, but, you know, every bit helps.
Listen, I have a treadmill. I haven't gotten on it yet, but I have the good intentions.
Right.
If I found out I was terminal tomorrow, I'd pour lighter fluid on it and
Right.
dance while that sucker burned. Our Matthew Porter, our executive producer, is with us, and I think he's going through football withdrawal. 2 of his kids were fighting, and Matthew gave them a timeout for unnecessary roughness. True, but that happens all the time, even without football.
All the time.
You're raising a mean bunch.
Yes.
Ordain them and make them pastors, and that'll work in the church. Our producer, Jinx, is working hard in his little glass booth. Jinx treats his body like a temple, the temple of doom. What are you eating, Jinx? And by the way, get a haircut.
Yes. I'm eating Trace Leche's birthday cake.
That works. Our video director and IT guy, John Myers, is in his tech bunker. John was born a white male. He currently identifies as a Jedi. And Dr. George Bingham is the president of Key Life. Some say these intros are only good for cheap laughs, but George says that's the only kind we can afford. And he would suggest that you send a gift and we'll be faithful with it. And then, of course, Kathy Wyatt is the soft feminine side of the program. Kathy, no invitation to your annual Valentine's Day baking party?
Not a baking party. It's a mother-daughter tea, and I'm looking at all your faces. You qualify neither as a mother or a daughter.
Well,
So you're not invited.
After the program, we might be able to pull that off.
Stop.
I don't see it happening, Steve.
Listen, we're going to laugh a lot, but we're going to talk about something really serious on this program. And might I suggest before we begin, if you have small children, this program might not be the kind of program that will be appropriate for little ears. And we may get down and dirty, and it could be adult conversation. And unless you want to answer a lot of questions that you don't want to ask, you probably ought to go to McDonald's and get a milkshake instead of listening to this program. And if you get angry because we offended you and your children, you will not be able to say that I didn't warn you. Dr. Preston Sprinkle is a biblical scholar, an international speaker, and a New York Times best-selling author. He also serves as president of the Center for Faith, Sexuality, and Gender. Preston has given talks to thousands of people worldwide on those same topics. And his latest book, which I hold in my nicotine-stained fingers, is titled Embodied: Transgender Identities, the Church, and What the Bible Has to Say. Preston, thank you so much for taking time out of a busy schedule to be with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me back on. I think this is my second time.
A lot won't come back the second time, but you're a brave man. You're a brave man to write this book. And I want to thank you for it. I spent this weekend reading every word of it, and I felt like I was drinking from a fire hydrant. I don't think any of my views have changed. I'm to the right of Genghis Khan. I'm orthodox politically and theologically. I believe it all. It didn't change my views, but it did change my heart. And for that, I want to thank you. I don't even know where to begin. I tell you what, Preston, let's start by defining some terms. There are a bunch of definitions. And by the way, one of the best statements in your book, and it's repeated, is that when you meet somebody who's one transgender, you've met one transgender. So this is very complicated as we talk about this issue. But define what in the world is transgender?
Yeah. So, I mean, if you've met one trans person, you've met one trans person, and each one's going to use the term in a different way. I mean, there's many different ways in which people will use the term trans. So let me just give you two examples. I have a friend who experiences gender dysphoria. That's the psychological term used to describe people who have some kind of incongruence between their biological sex and their internal sense of who they are. And so my friend she's always experienced gender dysphoria from a young age. She's biologically female and believes she's biologically female. There's that dysphoria that she experiences, doesn't know what to do with it, but she's trying to follow Jesus in that. And she will use the term trans to describe an aspect of her life, her experience with gender dysphoria. I have another friend who is is biologically male, and he says he's trans, and he's fine with the pronoun he. I always get asked that question, and we can probably get into that later. But he does believe that internally he is a woman. In fact, he lived his whole life kind of in secret. So he doesn't just struggle with gender dysphoria. He actually believes that he is a woman, even though he is biologically male. So those are two very different uses of the term trans. And some people will say they're trans if they just don't match up to certain gender stereotypes that our culture and church often promotes. And so, yeah, if somebody says they're trans, your next question should be, hey, I'd love to understand what you mean by that. Don't assume that, that you know what they mean when they say they're trans.
Well, explain intersex to us.
So, yeah, trans typically has to do with the incongruence between the body and the mind. So if somebody says they're trans, unless they have an intersex condition, then they are fully biologically male or female. There's no ambiguity there. Whatever incongruence they experience, it has to do with their mind. Now, intersex is a broad term used to describe, anywhere from 16 to 20 different medical conditions. The doctors call them disorders of sex development as in biological sex. So if somebody has an intersex condition, that means they have some kind of atypical feature in their sexual anatomy or their sex chromosomes. Now, it's important to understand that an overwhelming majority of people with an intersex condition, it's a very minor condition. So to where there's no ambiguity of, whether they are male or female. Some people don't even know they have an intersex condition until later on in life. It can be so minor. But there is a small percentage of people with these disorders of sex development that are, and I'll just throw it out there and we can wrestle with it. They are both male and female. I have a friend who has XX and XY chromosomes, full male anatomy, full female anatomy. And if you met my friend, you would you wouldn't be sure whether this is a male or female. And that's precisely because they are both. But I do think it's helpful to keep intersex in a separate conversation and not just map it upon transgender, because again, these are two quite different kinds of experiences.
Does biology trump gender?
That's the question, Steve. Yes.
I want a yes or a no from you.
No, you gotta read the book and what you have. So to reframe. So let me to reframe the question. If somebody experiences incongruence between their biological sex and their gender identity, the term gender identity is what is used to describe your internal sense of who you are. Okay. So if somebody experiences some kind of incongruence between their sex and gender identity, then which one are they and why? And so maybe we can talk about the why question. But yes, I do believe biology does trump.
And we will talk about that. We're going to talk about some of the conflicts, sports, feminine sports. We're going to talk about pronouns. We're going to talk about if you meet somebody who's transgender, what should you do? Tell them to go to hell, or is there something else that you need to do? You don't want to miss a bit of this. The church needs to address it. Trust me, like Jesus, we're going to return, and you should too. You're listening to Steve Brown, etc., and we're talking to biblical scholar and speaker Preston Sprinkle. His latest book is called Embodied Transgender Identities, the Church and What the Bible Has to Say. I would suggest this would be a great book to study in your church. Nobody will come, but you should at least give it an effort and see what happens. We honestly do need to start talking about this issue.
Preston, you kind of posed the question, and this is, certainly could get into adult conversation if anybody has little kids, but you posed the question before, and it seems like it's really important making that distinction between gender and sex and how you sort of define those, or how the trans community in particular defines that.
Yeah, hey, Preston, wait just a second. I was told to talk about little ears before we got into this segment, and George had my back. But if you have little kids around, you might want to go somewhere else during this program, because we're going to get down and honest about some things that maybe you don't want to spend time explaining. Preston, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, you're fine. No, that's a good call. I sometimes forget to do that with my own podcast. So yeah. So up until the early 1970s, sex and gender, these two terms were more or less used synonymously. There's biological males and biological females, and you would use sex or gender to refer to those two types of people. But after the 70s, people realized that there's a lot of kind of psychology and even sociology that surrounds the male and female experience. And so people began to use the term gender to refer to a different aspect of the male and female experience. So today, in mainly academic circles, but even in more pop culture now, it's becoming common to use the term sex to refer to one's biology, their biological sex, and gender to refer to the psychological, social, or cultural aspects of being male or female. And so psychological aspects of being male and female, that's, if you want to break it down into a subcategory, that's where we get the term gender identity. So you can have most biological males have a gender identity that matches their biological sex, but some people with gender dysphoria might have a different kind of gender identity or a different internal sense of who they are. And yeah, that's the question, right? So if somebody experiences that incongruence, which one are they and why? Which is, where we left off before the break.
So you're going to tell us why?
Well, I would encourage my listeners to don't just blurt out a quick answer. Like there's a big discussion going on out there regarding the why, So let me give you two theories that people propose to say that one's internal sense of who they are is actually more definitive of personhood than your body. Okay. The first one's called the brain sex theory. And this theory says that, there's male bodies and female bodies, and there's male brains and female brains. And for whatever reason, some people, wires get crossed, or if you're a Christian, you believe in some kind of fallen human nature, and maybe through the fall, somebody is born with a male body and a female brain, or vice versa. Now, if that's true, then that would be an interesting scenario, because, if we're to take Steve Brown's brain and put it into a different body, would that person be Steve Brown? I mean, I don't even know how to answer that question, really. But I mean,
without the voice, is it Steve Brown? It's got to have
a real high pitched voice. Yeah.
Right.
If he falls over in his office and you can't hear him yell, did he really exist?
Exactly. So that, I mean, we would all acknowledge that at least that's a wow. Are our brains more definitive of who we are than our bodies? Now, the problem is there's little scientific credibility to the theory that there are such things as male brains and female brains. Certainly males and females might think differently on a general level. For instance, the stereotype is all males are analytical and all women are emotional, but I know lots of people that don't fit those kind of categories. I know couples where the woman is much more analytical and the man is, much more emotional. But that doesn't determine whether you're a man or not. Like, we don't take our interests, our way of thinking, our emotions, and use that to determine whether somebody is male or female. So, the brain differences exist on a general level, not on an absolute either or kind of level. So that would be one proposal. Because some people say this whole trans thing is anti-science and there's I believe in biology. And it's like, well, I do too. And a lot of trans people do as well. But there is at least a conversation that needs to be had regarding the relationship between the body and the brain. The second theory is what's called the sexed soul theory. Some people say, okay, well, what if you're a male but have a female soul? That one is a little less credible. It's kind of thrown out there sometimes, but it's like, what does that even mean? Like, the very terms male and female are used to describe our bodied existence. However we conceive of the relationship between the body and the soul, to say that the soul is sexed, and it could be sexed differently than the body, that would need to be argued for, and few people do it well at all. So, yeah, at the end of the day, and there's so much more we can talk about, but those are the two big theories. But at the end of the day, no, I do think that one's biology, if they're clearly male or female, then that is who they are. And if their internal sense of who they are doesn't resonate with that, then that internal sense should be addressed, and rather than the body being aligned with the internal sense.
You're
nothing controversial.
You're picking up on how complicated this whole issue is. That's why it's important you get the book. It is an extremely clear and detailed book, and you'll know what you need to know to get around this entire subject. Matthew, you got a question. You want to pose it, and then we'll have Preston answer it on the other side of the break.
Sure. Well, I think what you're saying here is what opens the door, this idea of male, female, or something in between. Am I correct? That's what opens up the door to this idea of being non-binary, and there kind of being a spectrum and a whole laundry list of identities that people can go, that's me, that's the one I am. Is that correct?
Yeah. Okay, lots of different identities we can wrestle with for sure. Yep.
Okay, on the other side of the break, we're going to talk about this. Every time we do a program like this, we get angry letters. Don't bother. Certainly not with me. I'm too old to change. But this needs to be addressed. And the church needs to respond to all kinds of people with love and listening and acceptance. That would be what Jesus did, and that's not a bad example to follow. We'll talk more about it on the other side of the break. Don't you go anywhere. Thanks for hanging out with us as we're hanging out with Preston Sprinkle, author of Embodied Transgender Identities, the Church and What the Bible Has to Say. By the way, you can keep up with Preston at prestonsprinkle.com and on Twitter at prestonsprinkle.
Preston, ask you a question right before the break, and just to tee it up again, quick story. Maybe about 5 years ago, and this is kind of an example of how quickly this conversation has evolved. I was signing up for something online. I think it was a Google form, and it said choose male, female, other. And I posted it on Facebook as a joke, literally thinking this was a coding error that had slipped through. And a friend, a former coworker, goes, well, actually, Matthew, and he explained. And that coworker has actually now, he was a man, and now he has gone through surgery in order to try to become a woman. So that's literally how that's just a short time ago. And now obviously I would look at that and go, I know what they're aiming for there. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to the male versus female, that's kind of what you're touching on before. The non-binary is kind of something that opens the door to kind of a spectrum of identities that people can kind of go, oh, that's me. That's my niche.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Non-binary is become really popular, especially among younger people today. And when it comes to identities that are similar to, but different from, transgender, like non-binary, gender queer, gender fluid, and there's many, many others along those lines. This is where the sex gender distinction becomes really important. So if somebody says they're non-binary, unless they have a significant intersex condition, they are still male or female, but in terms of their biological sex. So non-binary has to do with their gender identity. So again, gender identity, your internal sense of who you are. Now, what does that mean? What is that? I ask people that, really smart people, and they kind of, it's kind of, it's who you are, it's your authentic self. For these phrases, like, okay, but what is that? Can I take a blood test and determine your gender identity? The answer is no. Is it a metaphysical property? Is it a feeling? Can it come and go? And there's just a lot of ambiguity and confusion, I think, over what gender identity even is. So if somebody says they're non-binary, they would say they don't identify as either exclusively male or female, even though they are either male or female in terms of their biological sex. It's just their internal sense of who they are might resonate 90% male, 10% female. But then the question comes up, like, is male or female some kind of resonance? Or is it just something that you are, and non-binary typically has to do, for lack of better terms, with gender stereotypes. When they say, I feel 90% male, 10% female, that might mean they're like they like a lot of sports, but they still like the color pink, or sometimes they cry during a movie. So 10%, but those are just stereotypes.
Dude.
Like they're not like,
I cry in almost every movie.
yeah. So,
oh man.
and it does raise a question, like how helpful is it to have all these different identities, and for young kids, they're searching for who they are, and they're in communities where they're wanting to belong. And if a community has, a lot of identities that people are latching onto, and if they're not having community at the home or the church or whatever, then they're going to be drawn to, search out who they really are on the inside, yeah.
So Preston, you and I were at a conference together. You were actually speaking at it, and it was about a lot of issues revolving around sexuality in the church. And not a week, maybe it was 2 weeks after that conference, I was sitting in my office, and someone had set up a meeting with me, and we're in this meeting. And about halfway, it was a new person to the church, and they were kind of exploring Christianity. They didn't grow up in a Christian home, had kind of decided they were interested as a young adult. And about halfway through, just kind of casually in conversation, it came up that this person was transgender. They were presenting as male, and I assumed I was talking to a biological male the whole time, and I wasn't. And I was so thankful for that conference, because there were all kinds of things in that moment that I remembered from that conference on how to just talk in a way that is kind, and makes you a safe place for that person. And the person that wasn't why they wanted to speak to me. They didn't want to know my views about that as the church. But I realized in that moment, I could have very easily said a lot of things that would have made that person walk out the door and never come back. And so I know we're coming up on a break, but I would love on the other side, because I know there are people listening who are like, this isn't going to touch me. This is just kind of something that the culture likes to make a big deal about, but it doesn't touch my life. But it does. And there are probably people in your church, or at least people who are secretly struggling with this, that are part of your church. And so I would love for you just to kind of talk through just some basic ways to be kind and show care and love for someone who is transgender. So maybe we can do that on the other side of the break.
Let's do it. We'd love to.
And by the way, this book, Embodied Transgender Identities, the Church and What the Bible Has to Say, is a good book to give away. It's kind, it's compassionate, it's balanced, it's not judgmental in the wrong way, it's generous and gracious, and it might begin, if you're already in that discussion, to take the discussion to a different and important level. Everything you wanted to know about transgenderism, but were afraid to ask, we're going to ask some more on the other side of the break. Don't go anywhere. You're listening to Steve Brown, etc., and we sure do appreciate your being here. By the way, if you listen to this show, then make sure you're also on our Not Half Bad email list. Just go to keylife.org/subscribe. And we're talking to Preston Sprinkle, everything you ever wanted to know about transgenderism, but we're afraid to ask.
Yeah, Preston, before the break, I was just saying about having someone come into my office who had been checking out our church, and just they casually brought up that they were transgender, and I didn't know. Like it wasn't obvious to me during the meeting. And the reason I bring that up is I think sometimes as Christians we can feel isolated from certain things that are going on in the culture, or we could think, well, we're not really going to have to deal with that. And I think it misses the point is that we're called to be light, right? And we're called to reach people, and that includes reaching transgender people. And so one of the things I thought would be helpful was just to hear some ways that we as Christians can just be kind in the way we talk about and talk to transgender people, because so much damage can be done simply because we refuse to use the pronoun that they want us to, right?
Yeah, that's great. And I really love the practical questions. And as you, Steve, I know you've read the book, and I try to weave that throughout. We've been kind of heavy on the concept so far, but man, we just have to bathe all that in real life stories and people. And yeah, I mean, there's no one black and white response that I can kind of prescribe, but I love what you said, though. You said that you weren't shocked. The person said they were trans, and you didn't go, and then like get all weird and like, oh, okay, I don't know what to say. I don't know. That just makes somebody feel so shameful. And for most trans people, they've experienced so much shame, so much ridicule, so much silence. Best case scenario, just silence from the church. So to kind of like say, oh, cool, yeah, and just kind of like just like if somebody told you they we're a Dodgers fan or something, like don't freak out, and if I think if you have the opportunity, you don't want to be invasive, but if you want to say, hey, I would love, like, what's that been like for you? If you don't mind me asking, I would love to hear your story, just to get to know you more. And if they invite you into that, then be a super good listener, a learner. We have a lot to learn from trans people and trans experiences. I can't do that I can share stories and stuff, but I can't tell you what it's like to be trans. So reading my book isn't going to, do that. You have to get to know actual people and just be a good listener. I mean, that I don't want to reduce everything to being a good listener, but sometimes Christians aren't very good listeners. We're very good speakers. Sometimes we're incredibly good judgers. But just to listen with a genuine desire to want to get to know somebody, that can go a long way, especially if somebody has not experienced that from the church.
So we're in the realm of the practical, and you mentioned the pronoun things. Just throwing this out there, real question for everybody. To do the pronouns, if somebody is a man but they identify as a woman, for example, if you say she or her, are you in some way validating or affirming this disconnection? Is it not worth fighting over semantics when you're trying to reach somebody for the gospel? Is it just a wash? Just go with it?
Yeah. The pronoun question is really tough. I mean, I spend almost 10 pages unpacking it in my book, because there's no quick and easy answer. And there's really good people on both sides of this debate. Some say, no, you should use pronouns that match their biological sex. Other people say, no, you should use the pronouns that they want you to use. And that's where I would land. I do take a view, what I call pronoun hospitality. God met us where we were at. He spoke our language. He used our pronouns, it's not an exact parallel, but I mean, that whole posture, incarnational posture of God, of meeting someone where they're at. I think that does apply to this debate, language is shared social space. You have two people with different worldviews sharing the same linguistic, space between them. So if we just demand that everybody on the other side of that shared social space has the same worldview, same beliefs as us, we're not going to be effective for the kingdom at all. So yeah, language is flexible. Some people say, yeah, you're just feeding untruth, an untrue view of somebody's own personhood or whatever. It's like, well, I don't know. I think language is a little more flexible than that. And if you want to have any kind of relationship with a trans person, you gotta use the pronouns they want you to. Otherwise, that relationship is done before it even gets off the ground. So, yeah.
Preston, I'm old and I'm so I'm so confused. And I'm plowing through your book. Last week, I made a quick phone call as I was probably well into chapter 2 to a friend in another city who is dealing with this issue in her family. And I said, listen, I don't know whether you want me to tell you this or not, but we're going to do this interview, and this book is just absolutely blowing my mind, and I don't know anything about this subject, et cetera. And what a great opportunity it was to just spend some time with her. She immediately went online and downloaded it, started reading it, and we've talked a little bit about it since then. And somebody alluded a little bit earlier to, the whole issue of listening and the fact that sometimes, especially with an issue like this, we don't think that we necessarily know anybody who either is trans or has someone in their family who is, and everything. And so we don't think it's something that we need to become familiar with. I am back to rereading chapter 3 already because I'm so confused, and there's just, there's so much to it. So I just want you to know, thank you for number one, for writing it, but I hope that people won't look at it and say, no, especially in the church, no, not going to do that. That's not a good thing. Not going to become more aware or whatever, because I think the thing that keeps us away is our lack of knowledge and our unwillingness to listen. I'm overwhelmed by this, just overwhelmed by this.
And it's way more.
By the way, let me just also say, I did not know who KD and John were. When you said, I'm sure you figured it out by now, I went, no, I haven't. And then I asked Steve, I said, did you know who KD and John were? He goes, no. And I said,
no spoilers.
I feel so much better.
Oh, it worked. I thought it'd be too easy. I thought people wouldn't catch that. But yeah, there's, especially among young, if you want any kind of relevance with younger millennials or Gen Z, then we have to get a handle on this conversation. There's been a 5,000% increase in teenage females identifying as trans or something other than the biological sex in the UK, and that's similar to America. So yeah, we've got to engage this conversation. Silence is not an option.
The title of the book says what the Bible has to say, and we haven't talked much about the Bible. So you got to get the book. It is biblical in a very profound sense. And Preston, a lot of our guests won't come back twice, and you're a brave man to write this book and to join us the second time.
Yeah,
hope we can do it again.
Yeah, absolutely. We'd love to.
Hey, thanks for the time. Guys, we're going to come back and tell you who we're going to do it unto next week. You're going to be surprised, and it'll be less controversial than this one. Jesus said, go into all the world except to transgenders and lesbians and gays and people who are confused. Find the ones who are like you and tell them about Jesus, and Jesus will be pleased. No, he won't. As a matter of fact, that's why this discussion today was so very important. Kathy said she was old. She doesn't know anything. I'm old as dirt, and you have no idea what this kind of discussion does to me. It starts me spinning, and in a very good way. And I don't know of anybody who is better able to address this subject and biblically without compromising truth than Preston. He is kind and gentle and insightful. He's a biblical scholar, and he's willing to take the criticism that he gets for what he says. Maybe the rest of us ought to be willing to do that too. We've talked about maybe having him back at another time and a follow-up, because honestly, we just touched on this subject. There's so much more in the book, and you ought to get it and read it just so you're prepared and you know how to talk and listen and love the people to whom Jesus sent us. The people have changed since the first century, but Jesus hasn't. And the issues are still the same. And we're called to be people who are here for them. This has been a good way to think about that. Kathy, who's going to be on next week?
Our friends, Justin and Lindsay Holcomb, who we've had on before, are just great at writing children's books, not children's storybooks, but books that deal with children's issues. And this new one that they've written is titled God Made Me in His Image, helping children appreciate their bodies. There's a tremendous amount of body shaming and on and on and on and on, with kids that manifests itself throughout the years, into adulthood, et cetera. And so Justin and Lindsay decided that this was a subject that needed to be addressed. And so, and it's a great book. It's the artist who did all the pictures and everything did a great job. So for those of you who were encouraged not to let the little ears, you all might want to be interested to listen and maybe get the book and read it with your kids. So next week.
All right. That'd be a great program. I hope that you'll join us next time, same place, same time. And between now and then, don't do anything we wouldn't. And that gives you a wide, wide berth.